In conversation with Jürgen is Carson Chan, curator and journalist. Please welcome.
We are trying something a little different. It's not a presentation, then kind of a question and conversation. He's going to interrupt me once in a while, and I think we're going to break it up that way. You want to interrupt right now?
Right now? No, you start first. Or I mean,
Okay.
maybe we can. Alonso spoke a little bit about your kind of accolades, but I guess one thing that we can think about, I guess now you've developed almost like a persona as an enfant terrible in the current architecture world, very much separate than a lot of things that are happening. As you show us how you started and your kind of interest in patterns, maybe you can start a little bit by telling us how you began your road to design in architecture, from a student in Stuttgart to New York, and to now.
Well, when I think back, it was always kind of easy for me to draw and kind of get immersed in some kind of artistic something, drawing, building models, building sculptures, whatever, when I was a kid, when I was 12, 15, 16 years old. So that's when I actually forgot about time. I had to play piano and bassoon, and it was always a nightmare to practice. And every 5 minutes were kind of a really long period. So I discovered that there's something that is very easy to me. But in music, I was very interested in certain contemporary composers, which I discovered very early on, like Condon Nancaro, which is a kind of strange, special composer who moved to Mexico City and composed for player pianos. And his musics are very much about kind of repetitions and patterns, but also fusions of very canonical compositions of Bach and then also jazz infusions. And this kind of clash of different disciplines and also, let's say, categories, genres, was very inspiring. At some point, then I felt that pieces that are larger than a person, where you can walk around, where you can walk through, is something that really attracted my attention. The move to architecture wasn't so far away. Mm-hmm. So then I started studying architecture in Stuttgart. Felt it was a good education, but there was something missing which teaches you how to actually find your own voice or your own concerns while you're doing architecture. I was lucky to get into Cooper Union in New York and study there for a year.
This is around
1990. But it was very painful. Then there was some kind of discovery, and at some point I knew I had to do this a little longer, and that's when I moved on to Princeton, who actually put all these kind of questions and searches and this kind of trying to formulate why you're doing architecture, what you're trying to say with the means that you choose to do something, also into a more cultural discussion or kind of a critical context of discourse. So I think the patterns came in the music part, and also at some point I discovered these data protection patterns that you see here on the screen. What I'm gonna show today is somehow a search or architecture as a formulation of questions about context, about form making, about program, about occupation patterns and the performance qualities of spaces. But also how we try with these kind of searches and questions to expand the material of architecture. We now also have to think about what the virtual spaces that we create. What are the communication qualities of architecture? How does it mediate between a social interest and a cultural kind of agenda? And this goes along with kind of looking deep into these found materials that became kind of the source material for our work. You might find these patterns everywhere in every day of your life because they come to your house for free, and I'm collecting them, which is quite easy. You just don't throw them away. And these patterns, in my research about the history of these patterns, started around 1900, I think, with the advent of carbon paper and writing the original and the copy or the shipping slip and the invoice at the same time, ask for certain blocking or erasing of these informations. So these patterns, when you have multiple typewriting processes, is a very kind of strategic efficiency pattern that actually camouflages personal information or, let's say, discrete information. The collection I have by now are maybe 300 to 400 different patterns from all over the world, and friends and even people who come to my lectures send me them afterwards, so it's actually kind of a communal affair already. These patterns sometimes have numbers and letters on them, or they're very kind of graphic. They can be camouflage-like patterns or company logos. But what I'm interested in these patterns, they create a certain envelope or a skin between a personal and an official, an inside and an outside, and a discrete and an exposed condition. And it's this mediation between the two conditions that are interesting for us, that we are trying to thicken up to make it spatial and to inhabit exactly this layer of negotiation. So in a couple of steps, you see how the source material gets interpreted and enlarged, so we can go into it, becomes kind of a human scale version. This is an exhibition that was at the Berlinische Gallery here in Berlin till Easter, and it's a carpet that wraps and envelopes actually this whole big first exhibition space when you walk in, and it's somehow kind of a maze or kind of a riddle of trying to find out what is written or where the numbers are, because it gets more difficult when it actually is exposed in a different scale. But step by step, this was kind of the first move. It's also interesting to see how these patterns then become interpreted in a three-dimensional way. And here is one of the 5 cubes that we showed, which is from one side, looking at the cube, you have the original pattern. You see that on the upper left. When you look at it from the side, which is down here, you already start to see a very three-dimensional labyrinth space that you can start to wander through with your eyes. At some point in architecture, in a bigger scale, this would become kind of spaces to inhabit. But this was the starting point to then develop certain architectural proposals, sometimes very literally taken from the patterns into a three-dimensional space, most of the time more as a metaphor, as a background, as a thinking surface from where all these architectures start to develop.
I mean, I think what's interesting so far is you talked about your early interest in music, but you've shown in many art contexts, Venice Biennale, gallery shows, you were represented by a gallery, and the way that you start talking about architecture is perhaps uncommon, not showing context plans and sketches, but really talking about a concept, this data protection pattern. Do you see yourself sometimes, and you make sculpture as well, and I think we'll see some of that later on, but do you see yourself as an artist that happens to be making buildings and architecture, or perhaps an architect that also makes art? Or is there a difference?
Well, in our everyday work, the discipline doesn't really matter. It's somehow the context later on that makes the discipline. We are always interested in certain questions and kind of the process ideas, how to move from one state of designing to another one, how program or a site actually starts to give another twist to this development process. Sometimes it's more complex, sometimes it's less complex. But in the end, discipline is not really a question. It becomes a question when it goes out into the world, when the market hits, the product somehow, because the same design or the same object gets discussed completely different in an art context or in a design context or an architecture context. There are different words, there are different arguments, there are different concerns, there are different kind of projections. And I think that's very helpful for us to have this kind of ambivalent positioning where it enriches a discourse, and it also helps us to get feedback from all different kinds of viewpoints.
Mm-hmm. You can continue with this project because it's very much on this borderline between installation, interior space, and
yeah. But the lectures or the presentation somehow goes from small scale to large scale to also see how a certain kind of idea develops and gets reformulated. It's not necessarily chronological, but it helps to understand how certain steps develop. This is an exhibition called Mobility and Sustainability for the Autostadt in Wolfsburg. It opened about 3 years ago. And it's a 1,000 square meter space where you get informed or you can experience issues of mobility and sustainability. It's a kind of an artificial forest that you walk into with all these information screens and also objects and interactive elements where you can get a very kind of quick idea, or let's say maybe a feeling or an intuition about what mobility and sustainability means. At the same time, when you're really interested, you zoom in very, very deep into the information. And it's always constantly updated, remodeled, pieces are replaced by others, but it always remains within this labyrinth. It's also somehow a metaphor for how kind of our culture of uncertainty works when we talk about sustainability, which is how we actually produce, consume, move today with a certain concern about the future. And this is, with all the dead ends, all the kind of complex dependencies and so forth, put into an architectural proposal. This is just an hour by car away here from Berlin in Wolfsburg. On a larger scale, this is a dining hall for the university in Karlsruhe. This is an earlier project, but you see a similar idea of a skeleton, a space that somehow works in all three dimensions. It doesn't have to be always a surface to make a continuous environment. It's sometimes also kind of a structural system that's not tectonic and put together, but more of a fused understanding of spatial dimensions. In this case, it was a very tight site with a program that we had to fit onto the site. And we decided to keep a floor plate and a roof, and the situation, or the condition between the two had to remain elastic until we really fit in the whole program. And that idea, this concept, then became architecturalized in these structures that you see here. It is a dining hall for the university, which is also a student center, but you can understand the continuous ideas of floor to structure to ceiling, where it wraps you. It's kind of an all-inclusive space that also has certain acoustic qualities. Of course, smell is important here in this dining hall, but also kind of the atmosphere itself. That once it's open from the mornings till the evenings with only a short period of feeding hours, which is around lunchtime. So it really had to become a place that attracts students to hang out, to meet, and to work together.
I mean, you just mentioned future and the idea of thinking about future through architecture. And in a previous conversation we had, you said that you were very much inspired by how people used to think about the future in the past. How this optimism of the jet age, the Jetsons. Can you talk a little bit about how the relationship between this kind of optimistic future and architecture? One kind of paradox is, of course, buildings are permanent and they last for a long time. And the moment you build them, they already belong to the past. So how does one express future ideas through architecture?
Well, I think my generation, which is, I'm born 1965, we grew up with kind of a very negative and fearful future, at least in Germany. There were the Pershing rockets, there was nuclear power that's going to explode any minute, the acid rain killed all our forests, and so forth. So in a way, it was always this kind of very dangerous view about what's coming up. And I feel that that's also something I see in a lot of other people in different disciplines, that it's somehow a generation with a lost future that's now trying to reclaim that kind of idea of working for something better. And actually, there's hope for something better. In the 70s, which is maybe the period that I'm talking about, there was kind of a discussion and a movement coming to an end that was very hopeful in experimenting with, let's say, different forms of how people live together. What are the technologies? And chemical industry was really big. There was all this kind of research and understanding of how technology actually can create a different person, a different society, a different culture. Of course, it had to come to a certain limit because maybe discussions were faster than the reality, or the experiments were kind of faster than the culture or the societies. But I think after then 2 decades of always referencing back to the past, with postmodernism, deconstruction, always had to be kind of argued through something in the past. Now it was time to actually look back and look into the future as a reference that gives you a certain guideline. Now architecture, or building at least, investing is always about a better future, because otherwise nobody would invest. There wouldn't be anybody who actually would build something because he wants or she wants a worse future than now. So going back and taking this moment where future was still maybe positive, and trying to reincorporate that as a starting point, more as a question, is this something where we can start again to build up onto an image that guides us for the next couple of years, is maybe the reference where we see our projects, how they develop. Some images from the building. I'm not going to the technology, but this is also a very innovative building because it's actually a timber construction with a polyurethane coating. So it became also a prototype for sustainable construction here in Germany. And you see that it has certain qualities which makes it into kind of an object, because a lot of things that you would usually have in a building is, let's say, a metal flashing at the top to protect the rain, or when the rain hits the lower part, you need a different material. This polyurethane coating actually makes a whole surface on the roof, on the sides, on areas where the water hits it. And that makes it also, in a way, kind of abstract and moves it away from being an architecture more towards maybe an object or a sculpture. On a larger scale, this is a building that's going to be finished, or it's actually already finished outside, but the interior is still in the making. It's a courthouse in Hasselt in Belgium. And also, this is a timber construction on the outside. Inside is quite regular. And you see it here. It's actually the area around the main train station on a master plan by West 8, and this is the first building that's built here. We also deal with certain issues of patterns and perforations in the facade. It's next to the train station, and you see it here as kind of the new dominant entry into the city. It's only the first one in a whole row of buildings, so it actually looks a little bit out of scale, which is an interesting kind of clash right now, but it will change in the future. And one more step up, this is our highest project right now. It's 100-meter high tower in Düsseldorf. We hope to start constructing in about 1.5 years. Now it's in the zoning process. It's a tower 5 degrees tilted and sits in the very center of Düsseldorf. It's right now in discussion to become a Japanese trade center. There's a huge Japanese community in Düsseldorf. You see it as part of a whole development here on a former post area. This is our block with a tower running up here. So it's all these kind of long strips that at some point move up, and these two ones actually pair up to become this high-rise here in the very center.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about your visual language. You talked about how, because of the generation that you're from, to try to resist a certain kind of backward looking and try to look forward. The straight line is kind of a hallmark of modernist architecture, of rational thinking, but you, I guess, quite famously use curved lines and curved shapes. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your design process, and specifically about this Jürgen Mayer look that we can all recognize.
Yeah, I think there's a certain development, of course, where you, after 15 years now of working, you develop a certain, let's say, cross-reference from one project to the other. The curve, or let's say, the medium that we choose to move from one direction to the other, in this case is a curve, helps us to create certain continuities and a certain organic, let's say, character that makes the building not into a kind of a collage or something that's put together, but it's actually something that creates a unity and then an embracing. When I look back to the 70s, which I'm doing again, and I look at the 45-degree angles, these chamfered corners that you see a lot in brutalist or in concrete buildings, I think it's kind of the first step where this kind of sculptural idea of moving around, from one dimension to the other, already talked about the sculptural understanding of architecture and space making, which is kind of an enclosure, this envelope idea. And I think this is somehow an update maybe to that chamfer architecture. Now I'm jumping to another scale, which is Georgia, and it's more, let's say, smaller projects, but in very acupunctural, precise positions in the country. This is the first project that we built. It's a cafe and a sculpture. We were called by the government, the still current president, who liked our project in Seville that I'm showing afterwards, to do certain public architectures that actually are part of the new image that Georgia creating for this new identity, opening up to the West. investing into infrastructure to make the country run. Now they're building the first highway they ever have. They had to build, and this is what you see down here, the border station between Georgia and Turkey on the Black Sea. Which country cares about how their entrance architecture or goodbye architecture looks like? It's not a building that separates the two countries, but it's actually a meeting point. You can rent conference rooms there. You have these viewing platforms to overlook the sea. So it's a different understanding how a country actually mediates and communicates also with its neighbors. Another very fast project we built is a little airport in Mestia, which is up in the Caucasian Mountains, next to this UNESCO World Heritage Site with the towers. And you can see also some kind of references to the history here, of course, with our building. In the same town, we built a small town hall, which is this one here. Even here, you might have references to the historic architecture with the pitched roofs. It's something that also gets reconfigured into contemporary language. This is the police office, the police station. Also here, public institutions, not as kind of a power architecture that offends you to go in there, but as something that's kind of creating curiosity, that wants attention, that actually wants you to come in and find out what's going on, something that actually helps you to understand that the country is going through a transformation.
I mean, recently in Mark magazine, which featured a lot of the projects that you're showing here, you discussed working in Georgia and how completely different it was. You were invited to Georgia by the government and to propose different ideas, and your office proposed drawings and sketches, and it was almost as if the next time you went there, they were built already. The airport in Messia was built in 3 months. And so this is a very different way than building in Berlin. For example, I think what's interesting and exciting is that it proposes a much more, let's say, casual, but a completely different model of making architecture. I don't know, tell us a bit more about this, and what were your first thoughts, and how did you come to embrace another method?
Well, actually, when I was getting the first phone call, I didn't know what to make of it. I was at the party the weekend before, and I met a lot of people with names of Fun and Sue and something. So, and we had a lot of alcohol, so this was kind of my memory of the evening. So on Monday or Tuesday, I got a call from Gabriela von Habsburg, who is now actually the ambassador of Georgia here in Berlin. And I said, oh, hi, how are you? How was the weekend? Because I thought she was one of the people I met at the party. She was not. She was sitting in the office of Saakashvili in Georgia and said, oh, I'm sitting here right now with the president of Georgia, and we would like to invite you to talk about the project. And I was like, okay, how do we do this? Is he coming here? Do I fly over there? Yeah, you'll hear from us in 2 days. And actually it happened. I flew there. It was a very interesting conversation about the idea of how architecture actually represents a country. We talked about a very specific site in the center of Tbilisi, which in the end we didn't build and the project didn't go anywhere. But from there on, there was a conversation about a lot of other architectures. And it was kind of a situation in need where a lot of infrastructure had to be built. I think I compare it a little bit to the 50s in Germany, where we needed bus stations. There had to be a train station. There needed to be a town hall, just, that something would run. And I thought that, or my understanding was that Saakashvili wanted to create a kind of a running country in the time that he's still a president. So it would actually show the dynamic already in places where there might not be a real change yet. For example, these are the rest stops that we built in Gori. And this is in a section where the highway already is running by. But there are also rest stops now in the construction where there is no highway yet. But they bring a supermarket, they bring a cultural space with exhibitions, they bring a roof for farmers market for the neighborhood. And it already kind of shows a certain kind of development and activity to the people who still might feel in remote areas of the country that they're not part of this new Georgia yet. But it's true, like how to work there. It's we send the drawings. In every project actually has a different dynamic, but it's also somehow a learning curve for the construction industry there, that they get confronted with a contemporary architecture to find out how to build it. And we are in discussion with them. Sometimes they're very independent. In some cases, they want us more on board. But actually, it's very different in different cases.
But this idea of helping to build up a country anew, and the question of architecture and ideology, it could be something interesting to talk about right now. Georgia is formally, known as a democracy, but in many ways, it's a competitive authoritarian system as well. And so I guess the best case scenario is that all this architecture, new ideas, new shapes, herald a new country, herald a new thinking. The worst case scenario is it could cosmetically create PR for a country that's not really changing, but it looks like it is. How does this play through in your mind as an architect, both I guess as a designer, but a conscious one, and as well as architect as a service provider?
Well, I think it has both, and I think we came in a moment where there was no time somehow maybe to develop a certain, let's say, democratic way how to go about certain issues, because they just had to be built. I mean, this airport had to be done in 3 months in their time schedule. Things changed since then. I mean, our last commission we got a year ago. So since then I got calls from offices in France and Holland to ask me how is it to build in Georgia, because they want a competition for a town hall or for something else. And I go, well, wait, this was my direct commissions like last year. Do they have competitions now? So actually it's gonna change, and it's already changing. The president is not the president anymore. He still is, but he was elected out by Ivanishvili, who is gonna start now. So it still proves that it's kind of a democratic attempt to run the country. And I mean, you have to see how it develops. But I think what I hear from a younger generation, they feel that they're part of, at least what they want, part of the Western world, that this architecture anchors them also into a context and a discourse that's different. And we are not the only architects. There's also Fuxas, who is building there. UN Studio is building an airport. Michele De Lucchi, he built the interior of the President Palace. So it might look like we are the only ones working there, but it's a country that explodes, that works so much. The whole coastline of the Black Sea builds one 5-star hotel after the other. Tourism becomes really big. So I think we were maybe lucky, and also this creates a certain conflict, of course, to be involved in this country in a moment where a lot of things had to be done just to make it a normal running country.
No, I think that the idea that building codes and ideas coming through buildings from outside one system into another system is definitely really interesting. I remember when SOM, large corporate firm, was building in Kazakhstan, and they were one of the first to build huge towers there. Some friends were working on the project, and they said that the building codes there required that men exit emergencies before, and then it was horses, and then it was like women. And these were antiquated kind of building policies and building codes and zoning rules that through this project, through an international kind of status building, changed the coding in that country, which I thought was a really interesting process. This is a sculpture, right?
Yeah, this is a sculpture, and it's maybe quite interesting in the process how this country works. One of the last ideas of Saakashvili was to build a new town for 500,000 people on the Black Sea coast. There's a lot of pressure from people who are moving into Georgia, a lot of Asians also, and of course people from Ossetia and Abkhazia who actually had to leave these areas when the war with Russia happened. So his idea was to build a new town, and to mark this new town there was a big boulevard. It's already built, a small town hall that's built, and a sculpture which is on the end of the pier. When we were asked to design the sculpture, it was actually part of a roundabout, in the center of a roundabout, and at some point we got the information that they moved it into the sea and it's on the pier, which is completely fine with me. It looks actually much better now with all the splash. It happened with other projects too. We designed a small town hall for one town, and it was built in a completely different other town. And then we designed a lot of things, and they said, yeah, it's approved, but we never heard about it again. And the first cafe I showed was one of 5 designs for a cafe in Tbilisi, and actually it was built with us knowing it in Batumi. So it's a very adventurous country, and in a way, you know, in the beginning I got really angry, now I'm smiling about it, because I think it's actually just a different culture and a different way how to deal with things, and in the end, we were able to also experiment a lot of things in architecture that we could never do here. And so it's kind of also a gift to be part of this process. I'm showing this sculpture, which is kind of a marker, this splash in the Black Sea, as an indicator for a town that might not actually happen, because the new president already said he doesn't continue with the idea of Lasika. So it might be a lonely sculpture rusting along in the Black Sea coast, which also could be a nice image. But this helps me to bridge to Seville. This is a competition we won in 2004, and it's maybe our most complex project so far in terms of relevance towards history and archaeology as part of a contemporary culture, which was actually at the edge of course, kind of collapsing in the last couple of years in Spain, and now becoming kind of the anchor piece and the icon for contemporary or maybe even a future Seville city. What you see here is in the very heart of Seville, the Plaza de la Encarnación, supposedly the largest medieval downtown in Europe, and you have these very narrow streets, and then these openings for the cathedral or for the town hall with the plaza, or now for Metropole Parasol, that you only see last minute, like you come through a small street or a little alley, and all of a sudden you have like one of these big buildings or spaces in front of you. And it actually is also similar in terms of its strategy, how to mark and change the image of a place, as Georgia is doing it as well. In this case, Seville had to kind of bridge the quite good developed downtown of the southern part towards the northern part, which was a little shady maybe in the 2004 times, but also to compete with other Spanish cities like Bilbao or Tenerife or Barcelona, and then also attracts a certain interest for tourism and industry, innovation industry to come to Seville. In the very center, you saw the building sitting actually on the side of the former food market. And when the food market was taken out because it was run down, it was in the 70s when everything was about cars and getting rid of old infrastructure that was falling apart. In around 1990s or something, 1995, the idea was to build a parking garage. And when they took out the ground, they found all these Roman ruins, and that's when everything stopped. By then, already ideas of cars in the inner city was kind of changing. And the competition asked for keeping this archaeology as part of a window into the history of Seville, bringing back some kind of food market as a local neighborhood food market, having an icon for an urban place for the 21st century. And we also introduced, this was our main proposal, a shadow, and climate and atmosphere that helps you to actually enjoy the space during the day in most of the year. This is the archaeology downstairs. You have mosaics, you have oil lamps and things that you find in a Roman city. This is now the view of this wood construction. Again, it's a similar construction to the dining hall in Karlsruhe, where we have these laminated wood timber plates with a polyurethane coating. It has certain aspects that I can explain later, maybe if that's of interest. But what you see is this clash of contemporary architecture and this very rich downtown of Seville, and the layers of history, which is the archaeology, the presence, the everydayness, which is the market and the plaza. And of course, when you go up and you have this beautiful view to the edge of the city and beyond, creates a really important layering of public spaces. Shadow is one of the key elements and designed elements here, which always looks different at different times of the day. So time, shadow, weather, climate is all part of the architecture here. Always this dialogue with the history is important. You see these conflicts. You can also see how it's designed on the computer, because you have sometimes these kind of surfboard plates hanging at the edge, because they're the leftovers of this orthogonal, now south-oriented grid, 1.50 meter by 150. Inside this invisible organic shape that creates these mushrooms. We designed the roof as kind of very organic, let's say, form, because we had to constantly adjust it in discussions with the archaeologists or with the landmark department or even the structural engineers to make it somewhere a little bit bigger, sometimes a little higher, lower, whatever. And then we had to bring down the loads on very selected parts because we couldn't touch the archaeology on every spot.
It's the biggest timber construction in the world, or?
That's what we are told by the wood construction company, yeah. And it's also the biggest glued bonding technology structure in the world. It's something that you don't really see, but the connections from one timber plate to the other are glued into each other with steel rods 50 to 90 centimeters into the wood, and only the glue actually holds them together. And was maybe the most difficult part, to actually deal with the forces from this one plate to the other.
So how long does a glued building last?
Well, officially forever, but the process is quite interesting. It's a glue by the Fraunhofer Institute, and we had to test how it also performs in temperatures that are a little higher. The performance temperature is 70 degrees, and we weren't really sure if this works for climate change that we have to maybe expect in the next 100 years. Also, when the sun hits it, it gets really hot at the steel connections, and we had to test how the temperature changes down into the steel rod when it goes into the wood. But it proved to be okay. After 4 centimeters, the wood takes it away. And to be on the safe side, we actually do a tempering process. So when the steel joints are glued in, the whole thing goes into a chamber that is heated up to 80 degrees. The glue also then raises with the performance rate up to 80 degrees, and therefore I think we are kind of safe for a couple of years. But now, after it's built, I think the biggest, achievement and the biggest joy to see this project in the city is how it's actually used and how it became part of the everyday life of Seville. Here is Semana Santa, which is the Holy Week before Easter, and the whole city shuts down. You have these processions, these floats with Jesus Christ and Madonnas, and they are actually floated through the city with a very special music, and it becomes part of a ritual that the whole city kind of falls in trance somehow. It also hosts a lot of different festivals. Of course, flamenco is maybe the most obvious one, but they also present new cars or do manage basically the whole building and site in different categories. There's also a Facebook page, of course. But it already showed up in 4 or 5 music videos, from very cheesy Spanish pop songs to even hip-hop, to another cheesy one. You see it also for the public viewing, for the Euro Games. I think this was just a carpet of people, which was amazing to see. It was really part of, that communal experience of soccer in Spain, and they even won, so it was actually, I think, the best place to be. It also was part of a movie, a thriller, or like an action movie where there was a shooting. It is part of advertising already. It is actually the hub for Gay Pride, and also the Cartoon Festival used it. And it was the hotspot for the Revolución de Indignados last year, where they had meetings and discussions. They had sit-ins, they had huge demonstrations and concerts, and they even every column actually had a different function. One was the kitchen, one was kind of the organizational board, one was the reception, and so forth. And there were also sleep-ins. And I think when you manage to build a public space that even allows you or invites you to stay there overnight, kind of creating an interior out of a public space, that's quite a gift that the city built for its people.
I mean, I think what...
This goes to the mayor of Seville, I have to say.
I think what's definitely, as you showed, probably the greatest achievement of the project was how do you change a site that was formerly just a parking lot into now that it's used and it's alive and people use it for all sorts of different reasons. What of that process have you learned? How much of it was designed and this is exactly what you want people to do? And how much could you reproduce in another future project? How do you make a public space? How do you make it work as well as this one does? And what does that have to do with the mushroom shape?
Well, I think we were very lucky in Seville. It's a culture or a city that actually is lively 24 hours, and people are on the streets anyways. Maybe not during the sunny, lunch times, but it's kind of a gift for any architect that does a public space, because they're just people, liking to celebrate the communal experience in the streets. We had certain references in the design, which was the undulated stone roof of the cathedral. I didn't show the pictures today. The cathedral also inside is this structural space. Somehow it's similar in the dimensions. And in neighboring plazas, you have these huge trees that are actually doing the same thing naturally grown as we did built in our architecture. And in the communication that we had with the citizens and in boards or in hearings when we presented the project, it was always important to make these references, and they were kind of inspiring us anyways during the design process, but also was helpful to explain these references, so it's not a drop sculpture that comes from nowhere, but it has really precisely certain relationships to what is key and unique to the city of Seville. And I think this is what made it so kind of supported also by the citizens. But it needed always one person who makes the final decisions, which was the mayor then, and he was actually the one to be celebrated to manage a project through all the different boards and political parties and fights, and you can imagine what happened. In the end, I think the structure of the parasol was elastic enough to adjust to all these different forces, but it was an image that always remained independent from changes to the program downstairs or to differentiations of the spaces. What it made it difficult was the public-private partnership idea behind the project. So the city paid half of it and the company paid the other half. And so as an architect, you actually start to mediate more between the two parties than being actually the advocate of the client towards the construction company. And that made it a completely different form of dialogue. This was, I think, the most difficult part for us in the project. A couple more projects. This is just the wrapper-up of the lecture. It's actually the enveloping back to the patterns. You see how even when we are designing now, independent from starting with a pattern, the thinking is kind of the background of our design process, how it actually works well within the whole collection of varieties that is our found material that's all about enclosing or opening up.
And I think, 2 years ago, you won the Audi Urban Future Award, and with a proposal that was kind of a society in which a future society where everyone was completely interconnected, and it was represented in this kind of white, kind of 3D, gravity-less kind of space. What is? If you were to, you're doing so much in Georgia, if you were to able to kind of envision some kind of future, what would be the Jürgen Mayer future world be like?
Well, the future question always is very difficult because I'm still trying to figure out what the presence actually is. But in a way, I'm hoping for a variety and multiplicity, and our part is only one part of a mosaic that's quite unique. I'm not kind of dogmatic about architecture. This is the way how it should look like. Actually, I want a lot of voices to share and create conflicts. So in a way, I hope that future is always about a debate and about the testing of ideas, not to be too safe and kind of trying to figure out, what are the answers. But it's more about the questions that we raise with what we're doing.
Thank you.
More questions?
I think it's just about lunchtime, but if there's some questions.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your experiences with integration of community, as that's something really strong within your work. However, your work also pierces ancient traditional architecture in a very strong and beautifully transformative way. But I was wondering how you deal with the communities that you're going into within Georgia and within Seville, how you actually get them to understand what you're doing and why you're doing it and what it means for the future.
Georgia is very different. It's actually a kind of an acupunctural, drop idea. And it's more of, let's say, an understanding of what we can contribute to the country. And these things might not last, for like 20, 40 years. There are instant institutions or infrastructures right now that's necessary. And I see it more as a kind of a transformative architecture at this point. With Metropole Parasol, it was very different because it was a very political project from the very beginning. And I think the intelligence of the project was there already way before any architect was on board. The city, I think, had different ideas about the site before. And this was the third competition, as far as I remember, where it was declared as an ideas competition. So there was not really the pressure to find the solution for the site, but it was opening up possibilities of what can be done. The first phase was completely anonymous, and then in the second phase, for the second phase, they selected 10 projects completely different. One proposed a park, another one had 3 high-rises on it, the third one was a huge Centre Pompidou, like blocking the whole thing. The fourth was, I can't remember, like a whole variety. And from then on, everything was completely transparent and public. All the projects were on the internet with blogs and all the text, all the drawings. We had to present the projects to each other, to the other competitors, but also in hearings and in public forums. And there was a question and answer, or let's say feedback part of the process in the second phase, which also happened a lot on the internet, of course. And this was helpful for us to see where we were criticized and where we maybe could go further than what we proposed in the first phase. And we were also very kind of encouraged to give our best because our project was the most celebrated one and the most talked about one in the internet. So we really pushed hard. We really tried to listen to what's discussed there, and we won. And then also the continuation of the discourse happened because I had to go to schools to present the project. I had to go to VIP clubs to present the project, to landmark departments. So the city really tried to have all different kind of parts of the society be informed and have a chance to talk about it and raise their concerns. At least that's the way how I saw it. And I think this was very helpful to have everybody already on board, even during the competition. It was not a design coming out of nowhere. People could see what is actually discussed and what are the alternatives. And I think this was part of why the dialogue and the acceptance already started very early on for this project.
Thank you.
More questions?
Let's talk about the Berlin city a little bit because I found it very interesting because like historically it has like west and east side of the architect, and there's so many abandoned spaces in East Berlin, which is I think is very fascinating and beautiful. But like, how do you feel about those abandoned spaces? Do you feel like it should be changed? Like it should be designed in a certain way, like a beautiful way, or clean up or something like that?
East Berlin, you say?
East Berlin.
Eastern?
East.
East Berlin, yeah.
Yeah, and there, for instance, there's an empty airport called Tempelhof, and there's a big discussion going on that government's gonna, do a little bit of trick, and since so many Berlin people enjoy the empty spaces, they're like getting a little bit angry, and we actually don't know how it turns out. So how do you feel about that?
But maybe it's a question for you. Also for
it's
me?
for you,
Okay. I think Berlin actually is still quite empty. And I think that's the big potential that we have. We might feel, and maybe there is actually so much construction more than what we experienced in the last 10, 20 years. But if you just walk around the corner, walk into the courtyards, you see all these big industrial buildings still very central in Berlin. So I'm not so afraid of that we run out of space soon. But I think that's the big potential that Berlin has, that we have these spaces that can be places of experimentation, of trials and errors, of temporary interventions that actually makes the city quite lively. And I think that's also what makes it so attractive for all of us to be here. Unfortunately, the architecture that happened is not so inspiring, the permanent architecture that we see in Berlin. There are very few examples where you feel it's something out of the ordinary. But it's part of also the market, and this might be actually also your, your problem, because people who buy apartments or who might rent spaces are also quite on the safe side. So if you build as a developer a beige building with some kind of columns or something that looks a little bit more traditional, you can be sure that people buy it right away because they know how it looks like. They know what they get, but that's what they think. If you build something that's a little different, you might have also problems in financing this because the bank might say, well, if you don't sell it right away, we are not so sure if we can support you because it might actually not be a financial success. Now, we built a building in Mitte, which is on Johannesstraße facing the Tacheles area, and it was exactly the case. It's differently looking, and it was a problem to sell the building for a long time. Now it's like sold for very high prices after the building was built. People saw it, and it's very successful. But the process usually works differently, that people have to sell first before they can start to build. And this actually builds on kind of maybe a not developed taste or not a developed vision or something that people are not used to buy into, which is a certain experiment or a certain vision or something different. You usually buy what you know what you're going to get. And this is also part of what you see here as a built reality in Berlin.
We have time for one more question.
My question is about how designing for a city differs from designing for a country. Having the opportunity to, try and embody or envision a political identity and a national identity versus just the zeitgeist of a city. How does that process change when you're designing for a country?
Well, if you design for a country like Germany, there's usually a competition that goes with every public building, and the competition has a jury which is a market and a dynamic in itself. Usually there are people who are professionally jury members in juries, and what you see, at least in Germany, that's my frustration here building in Germany, is that mostly it's some kind of box, sometimes a little bit more interesting, sometimes a little less interesting, that makes it in a competition because it's always kind of a process of agreement. And if you have a board or let's say a jury of 15 to 30 people, you can imagine there's always somebody who doesn't like something else. So in the end, what you see is actually a reflection of our kind of discourse culture or agreement culture that we have. When you build for a country like Georgia, it's different because there's mostly one person in this case, or two, maybe five, who make a decision. And that's also not what we understand as a democratic system, how, jobs are distributed amongst other people. I don't really have a solution for it, but I wish that we come back to a moment that we maybe had in the 70s, 80s in Germany, where architecture, and maybe this is really part of who is in the jury and actually who is the client or how brave is the client, where public architecture still has the function of projecting, of like risking something. If you look at the Staatsgalerie in Stuttgart by James Sterling, a fantastic building, a public building. Now you look at contemporary museums, it's like some box, with a stone facade, and that's it. If you look at maybe an office building from the 60s, 70s, it was maybe a boring box. Nowadays, companies actually are the ones who are investing into contemporary architecture. It completely changed where architecture happens right now. So actually the government now, I think, is not so much the interesting client. It's more the corporate and the, let's say, the private client who changed the situation. And it's maybe just reflecting where we are right now, where politicians always are more concerned about the next election period and really about leaving a mark.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.